Cops target, veteran single dad, for trespassing on his own property. Guns drawn. Child screaming, never knowing the man they tried to break was the FBI agent who had taken down criminals far scarier than them. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the winding country road as James Walker's old blue pickup rumbled along. The familiar sound of gravel crunching under the tires brought back memories of his childhood, each curve and fence post marking another step closer to home. In the passenger seat, 10-year-old Emma sat with her legs tucked beneath her, her brown curls dancing in the breeze from the cracked window. The radio played softly, an old country song about coming home, and Emma's sweet voice joined in with the chorus. "You know this one, Daddy," she said, nudging his arm with her elbow. James smiled, his deep voice joining hers. "Well, I should. Your grandpa used to play it all the time." Emma's eyes lit up at the mention of her grandfather. "Tell me about him again? About when you were little?" James adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, remembering. "He was the kindest man I ever knew. Taught me everything about this land. How to fix fences, when to plant crops, which birds meant rain was coming." He chuckled. "And he never could resist your grandmother's apple pie." "Like you can't resist my chocolate chip cookies?" Emma grinned. "Exactly like that, sweetheart." They passed an old oak tree that made James's heart skip a beat, the same tree he'd climbed countless times as a boy. The branches were thicker now, the trunk wider, but it stood just as proud as ever against the golden sky. Emma pressed her face against the window, taking in everything. "Will I have my own room, Daddy?" "You sure will. Upstairs with the window that looks out over the back field. In the spring you can watch the wildflowers bloom." "Really?" Emma bounced in her seat. "Can I paint it any color I want?" "Within reason," James said, trying to sound stern but unable to hide his smile. "Maybe not hot pink. How about light blue? Like the sky?" "That sounds perfect." They drove past Mr. Henderson's farm, the fields now worked by his son. The old barn needed a fresh coat of paint, but the windmill still turned steadily in the breeze, just as it had when James was Emma's age. The radio signal started to crackle, and Emma reached out to adjust it. An old hymn came through clear and sweet, and James found himself humming along. His father used to sing this one while working in the garden, his deep voice carrying across the yard. "Daddy," Emma's voice was quieter now. "Do you think Grandpa would have liked me?" James reached over and squeezed her hand. "Oh, Emma, he would have absolutely adored you. You're so much like him, always seeing the good in people, always ready with a smile." Emma squeezed back, her small hand warm in his. "I wish I could have met him." "Me too, sweetheart. But you know what? He left us something special. This farm, this land, it's like a piece of him is still here, waiting for us." They rounded the final bend in the road, and James felt his throat tighten. There it stood, the old white farmhouse, weathered but proud against the setting Sunday. The wraparound porch needed work, and the shutters hung a bit crooked. But to James, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. The pickup's tires crunched on the gravel driveway as James pulled up to the house. The engine ticked as it cooled, and in the sudden quiet, they could hear crickets starting their evening song. A warm breeze carried the sweet scent of honeysuckle from the old vine that still climbed the porch trellis. Emma sat very still, taking it all in. The massive maple tree in the front yard, the rusty weather vane atop the barn, the old tire swing swaying gently in the breeze. The last rays of sunlight caught the windows, making them glow like amber. James gripped the steering wheel for a moment longer, memories washing over him. Running through sprinklers on hot summer days, helping his father repair the roof after storms, his mother's voice calling him in for dinner. This place held every chapter of his childhood, and now it would hold Emma's stories too. He looked over at his daughter, seeing the same wonder in her eyes that he felt in his heart. Softly, his voice barely above a whisper, he said, "We're home, Em." The morning sun streamed through dusty windows, casting warm patches across the farmhouse's wooden floors. James Walker stood in the kitchen doorway, his hand resting on the worn frame where pencil marks still tracked his childhood height. Each subtle creak of the floorboards under his feet brought back memories. His father's hearty laugh, his mother's cookies cooling on the counter, the simple joy of family dinners around the oak table that was now long gone. "Dad, come look at this!" Emma's voice echoed through the empty rooms. He He found her in what used to be his old bedroom, pointing at faded baseball posters still clinging to the walls. "Were these yours?" "Sure were, sweetheart." James smiled, touching the curling edge of a poster. "Your grandpa took me to that game. I was about your age." Emma ran her fingers along the windowsill, leaving trails in the dust. "Can this be my room?" "Of course." James ruffled her hair. "We'll clean it up nice, give it a fresh coat of paint, any color you want." They made their way downstairs and out through the back door. The barn stood tall against the morning sky, its red paint faded but still proud. James paused, hearing echoes of his father's voice calling him for morning chores. The memory was so clear, the jingle of tools, the smell of hay, his father's patient instructions on fixing a tractor or mending a fence. "Look, Dad." Emma's delighted cry pulled him from his thoughts. She was chasing a yellow butterfly through the overgrown grass, her sneakers leaving paths in the dewy lawn. The sight warmed his heart. His daughter already finding joy in this place that held so many memories. They headed back to the truck to unload their belongings. James had just lifted a heavy box of kitchen supplies when the sudden screech of tires made him turn. Two police cruisers barreled into the gravel driveway, kicking up dust clouds as they skidded to a stop. 4 officers jumped out, hands hovering near their weapons. "Don't move!" the lead officer shouted, his face hard with suspicion. "Put that box down slowly." James carefully set the box on the ground, his movements deliberate and calm. Years of FBI training kicked in. Stay composed, show no threat. Emma ran to his side, grabbing his arm with trembling hands. "Sir, this is private property," one officer declared, stepping forward. "You're trespassing. There must be a misunderstanding," James replied evenly, feeling Emma's grip tighten. "This is my home. I inherited it from my father." "Yeah? Prove it." The lead officer's tone dripped with skepticism. "Let's see some ID and paperwork." "Of course." James kept his voice steady, though he felt Emma shaking against him. "Emma, stay right here while I get the documents from the truck, okay?" "Don't leave me," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm just going to reach into the glove compartment," James announced clearly, making sure all officers could see his movements. He retrieved a folder and slowly pulled out his identification and the property deed. "Here's my ID and the deed to the property. As you can see, it's been properly transferred to my name." The lead officer snatched the papers, studying them with narrowed eyes. The other officers shifted uncomfortably as minutes ticked by. James stood perfectly still, one hand resting protectively on Emma's shoulder, watching as realizations slowly dawned on their faces. Finally, the lead officer cleared his throat, trying to hide his embarrassment. "These appear to be in order." He thrust the papers back at James, but his eyes remained cold. "We'll be keeping an eye on you, Mr. Walker. Make sure everything stays legitimate." The officers retreated to their cruisers, but the lead officer paused, turning back with a warning look. "Don't give us any reason to come back here." James and Emma stood in silence as the police cars roared away, gravel crunching under their tires. The peaceful morning had shattered into something ugly and uncertain. The butterfly Emma had been chasing earlier fluttered past, unnoticed now. Emma's small voice broke the heavy silence. "Why did they treat us like criminals, Daddy?" James looked down at his daughter's confused face, his heart aching at the fear and hurt in her eyes. He had hoped to shield her from moments like this, but here it was, on their very first morning in their new home, the home that was supposed to represent their fresh start. The old pickup truck rumbled down Main Street, its tires crunching over weather-worn asphalt. James guided the vehicle past familiar storefronts that had barely changed in the 15 years since he'd left. The hardware store still had the same faded red awning. The post office's brick facade remained weathered but sturdy. Only the fresh coat of paint on Miller's grocery marked the passage of time. "Look, Daddy, they have a playground." Emma pressed her face against the passenger window, pointing at the small park across from the town square. "That's where I used to play when I was your age," James said, smiling at her enthusiasm. "Maybe we can stop by after we get our supplies." He pulled into the grocery store parking lot, the truck settling into an empty space with a gentle bounce. Emma hopped out, her sneakers hitting the pavement with excited energy. James watched her skip ahead, her brown pigtails bouncing, before following at a measured pace. The electronic bell chimed as they entered Miller's. Cool air conditioning washed over them, carrying the familiar scent of fresh produce and floor cleaner. "Mrs. Miller stood behind the counter, her gray hair pulled back in its usual tight bun. She looked up, recognition flickering across her face before her expression settled into something more reserved. "Welcome to Miller's," she said, her tone polite but lacking the warmth James remembered from his youth. "Thank you, ma'am," James replied with a gentle nod. He grabbed a shopping cart and began guiding Emma through the aisles. They worked their way through their list. Bread, milk, eggs, cleaning supplies. Emma clutched a box of her favorite cereal, the one small comfort James had promised her during their move. As they passed the canned goods, an elderly man James recognized as Mr. Peterson muttered just loud enough to be heard. "Town's changing. Too many outsiders these days." James felt Emma's small hand slip into his. He squeezed it reassuringly, continuing down the aisle, as if he hadn't heard. But he noticed how his daughter's earlier bounce had diminished, her shoulders slightly hunched. At the checkout, Mrs. Miller rang up their items with mechanical efficiency. Her eyes never quite met James's, even as she announced the total and handed him his change. "Have a nice day," she said, the words hollow. The drive to the gas station was quiet, Emma's usual chatter replaced by thoughtful silence. James pulled up to pump number 3, the ancient fuel gauge in his truck hovering just above empty. As he stood filling the tank, a patrol car pulled into the station. Deputy Carl Hensley stepped out, his badge catching the morning Sunday. James recognized him immediately from the previous night's confrontation at the farmhouse. The deputy's boots scraped against the concrete as he approached, his thumbs hooked in his belt loops. A sneer played at the corners of his mouth. "Well, well, if it isn't the prodigal son," Hensley drawled, positioning himself just a little too close. "Didn't expect to see you shopping in our stores so soon." James continued filling his tank, his expression neutral. "Just getting supplies, deputy. You know, Walker, this town has a certain way about it, certain standards." Hensley's voice dropped lower, edged with contempt. "We like things peaceful here. Don't need any troublemakers stirring things up." Through the truck's window, James could see Emma watching, her face pinched with worry. He replaced the gas cap with deliberate calm. "I'm not looking for trouble, deputy. Just trying to make a home for my daughter." Hensley's laugh held no humor. "Your kind always says that. But trouble seems to follow you anyway. Doesn't it?" He stepped even closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Word of advice. Don't get too comfortable." James met the deputy's gaze steadily, his voice leveled despite the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "I appreciate your concern, deputy. If you'll excuse us, my daughter's waiting." He turned away, walking to the station's office to pay. Behind him, Hensley called out, "Remember what I said, Walker. We'll be watching." The drive home was heavy with unspoken words. Emma sat quietly, her box of cereal clutched in her lap like a shield. As they pulled up to the farmhouse, James noticed something flutter on the front door. "Wait here, sweetheart," he said, stepping out of the truck. A piece of paper had been stuck to the door with a rusty nail. James pulled it free, reading the crude message scrawled in thick black marker. "You don't belong here, Daddy?" Emma's voice came from behind him. She must have followed despite his request to wait. "What does it say?" James crumpled the paper, tucking it into his pocket. But before he could answer, Emma spoke again, her voice small but steady. "Should we leave? Find somewhere else?" James turned and knelt before his daughter, looking into eyes that held too much understanding for their 10 years. He placed his hands on her shoulders, feeling their delicate strength. "This is our home now," he said firmly, his voice carrying all the conviction he felt in his heart. "This was your grandfather's house, and now it's ours. We belong here, Emma. Don't let anyone tell you different." Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the farmhouse's weathered windows. James adjusted his tie in the mirror, his movements careful and precise, old habits from his military days dying hard. In the reflection, he watched Emma twirl in her blue polka dot dress, her dark curls bouncing with each spin. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," James said, his voice warm with pride. Emma stopped spinning and smoothed her dress. "Do you think the other kids will like me, Daddy?" James knelt beside her, meeting her worried eyes. "Just be yourself, Em. That's all you ever need to be." The drive to church was quiet, their old pickup winding through streets lined with maple trees, just starting to show hints of fall colors. Emma pressed her face against the window, taking in the sight of families walking together along the sidewalks, dressed in their Sunday best. First Baptist sat on top of a gentle hill, its white steeple reaching toward the cloudless sky. James parked in the gravel lot, his heart beating a little faster as he helped Emma from the truck. A few people milling around the entrance gave them curious looks, but no one seemed openly hostile. As they approached the wide wooden doors, a tall man in a dark suit stepped forward, his face creasing into a welcoming smile. "James Walker? I'd know you anywhere. You're the spitting image of your father. Pastor Miller?" James extended his hand, remembering the kind voice that had presided over his father's funeral. "Welcome home, son." The pastor's handshake was firm and warm. He looked down at Emma, who half hid behind James's leg. "And who might this young lady be?" "I'm Emma," she said softly, peeking out. "It's wonderful to meet you, Emma. We have quite a few children your age in our congregation." Pastor Miller gestured toward the open doors. "Why don't you both come inside? Service is about to start." The sanctuary smelled of wood polish and old hymnals. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the worn carpet. James guided Emma toward a pew near the back, but Pastor Miller touched his arm. "Your father always sat in the third row," he said quietly. "It's still there if you'd like it." Before James could respond, a girl about Emma's age bounced up to them, her blonde pigtails swinging. "Hi, I'm Lily. Do you want to sit with me?" She smiled brightly at Emma. "We can share my coloring book during the sermon." Emma looked up at James, hope shining in her eyes. He nodded encouragingly. "I'd like that," Emma said, her shy smile matching Lily's bright one. James watched as Lily led Emma to a pew where several other children Saturday. His daughter settled in beside her new friend, their heads already bent together over the promised coloring book. Something tight in his chest loosened slightly. The service was familiar. The same hymns he remembered from childhood. The same creaking of old pews as people stood. And Saturday, Pastor Miller's sermon spoke of welcome and acceptance, of seeing past surface differences to the heart beneath. James felt more than one pair of eyes on him during those words, but he kept his gaze forward, his posture straight. After the final prayer, James expected the usual quick exit to avoid awkward conversations. But before he could collect Emma, two older men approached him. One walked with a slight limp. The other wore a Korean War veteran's cap. "Name's Frank Matthews," said the one with the limp, extending his hand. "Served in Vietnam. This here's Bill Cooper, Korea. James Walker, Afghanistan and FBI. After that, we knew your daddy," Bill said, his voice gruff but kind. "Good man. Helped me fix my roof one summer when my arthritis was acting up." Frank nodded. "Heard some talk around town. Don't put much stock in gossip myself. Rather, judge a man by his actions. Coffee hours starting in the fellowship hall," Bill added. "Join us?" James hesitated, but Emma was still absorbed with Lily and her other new friends. "I'd like that." The fellowship hall buzzed with conversation and the clinking of coffee cups. James sat with Frank and Bill, listening to their stories about his father, about their own service years. They didn't press him for details about his time away, didn't ask about the rumors. Instead, they talked about practical things. Which hardware store had the best prices, who could be trusted to work on his truck, whose vegetables to buy at the farmer's market. "Town's changed some," Frank said, "but good people are still good people. You need anything, you let us know. We take care of our own," Bill added firmly. James felt something settle in his soul, a sense of connection he hadn't expected to find. These men understood things that didn't need explaining. The weight of service, the importance of honor, the value of quiet support. The afternoon sun was low when James finally gathered Emma to head home. She was clutching a handful of drawings she and Lily had made together, her face glowing with happiness. "Can I come back next Sunday?" she asked as they drove home. Lily said they have Sunday school, and she promised to show me her favorite Bible stories. "Of course we can," James replied, catching her smile in the rearview mirror. That evening, after a simple dinner, James tucked Emma into bed. She insisted on taping one of her drawings, two stick figures holding hands, labeled Emma and Lily, to the wall beside her bed. "I made a friend, Daddy," she murmured sleepily as he pulled her quilt up. "You sure did, sweetheart." James smoothed her curls back from her forehead, watching as her eyes drifted closed. Standing in the doorway of her room, James looked at his sleeping daughter, at the drawing on her wall, and thought about the unexpected warmth of the day. Pastor Miller's welcome, Lily's friendship. The veteran's quiet support. The house creaked softly around them, settling into the night. Maybe we can make this work, he whispered to himself. The late morning sun cast long shadows across the barnyard as James positioned Emma's small hands on the hammer's handle. The old barn needed work. Its red paint had faded to a dusty pink, and some boards hung loose. But James saw potential in its sturdy bones. "Like this, Daddy?" Emma asked, gripping the hammer with determination. "Almost." James adjusted her grip slightly. "Remember, let the weight of the hammer do most of the work. You don't have to swing too hard." Emma's tongue poked out in concentration as she aimed at the nail James had started in the board. The hammer came down with a tentative tap. "That's it," James encouraged. "A little harder next time." Emma's next swing connected solidly, driving the nail halfway in. Her face lit up with pride. "I did it!" James ruffled her hair. "You're a natural, kiddo. Pretty soon you'll be running this whole renovation yourself." They worked together, father and daughter, the morning filled with the rhythm of hammering and the sound of their easy laughter. James showed Emma how to measure boards, letting her mark the cutting lines with her careful, childish handwriting. When she successfully helped him replace a loose board, they celebrated with a high five that left sawdust floating in the air. "Can we paint it red again?" Emma asked, brushing wood shavings from her overalls. "Like in the old picture you showed me?" "Sure can. Maybe we'll even—" James stopped mid-sentence, his trained eye catching movement at the edge of their property. A black sedan was pulling up their long driveway, stirring dust in its wake. Something about its official-looking appearance made his stomach tighten. The car parked, and a woman in a crisp business suit stepped out, clutching a leather portfolio. Her heels clicked purposefully against the gravel as she approached. "Mr. Walker?" she called out. "I'm Sandra Mitchell from Child Protective Services." James felt Emma press against his side, her small hand gripping his shirt. He placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "Yes, I'm James Walker. What can I help you with?" Miss Mitchell's eyes swept over the construction scene, lingering on the tools scattered nearby. "We received an anonymous report expressing concern about your daughter's welfare, specifically about dangerous working conditions." "Dangerous?" James kept his voice level, though his heart was racing. "I'm teaching my daughter basic home repair skills, with proper supervision and safety measures." "I see." Miss Mitchell made a note in her portfolio. "And you're qualified to provide such instruction?" "Ma'am, I'm a former FBI agent with extensive safety training. I would never put my daughter at risk." The social worker's eyebrows rose skeptically. "Former FBI? Do you have any documentation of that employment?" "My badge and credentials are inside. I can show you—" "That won't be necessary right now, miss." Mitchell cut him off. "Mr. Walker, are you aware that having a minor working with construction equipment could be considered child endangerment?" Emma's grip on his shirt tightened. "But Daddy's teaching me," she protested, her voice small. "I like helping." Miss Mitchell's expression softened slightly as she addressed Emma. "Sweetheart, I need to speak with your father alone for a moment. Would you mind waiting over there by the porch?" James felt Emma trembling. "It's okay, Em," he assured her quietly. "Go on now." Emma reluctantly crossed the yard, looking back over her shoulder every few steps. When she was out of earshot, Miss Mitchell's tone grew more serious. "Mr. Walker, I'll be frank. We've received multiple reports about you in the past week. Concerns about your background, your sudden appearance in town, and now this construction situation. Your claim about FBI employment seems convenient." James fought to keep his voice steady. "Those reports are false. I have documentation for everything. Property deed, my service record, Emma's school records. I'm just trying to make a home for my daughter. Nevertheless, I'll need to conduct a full investigation. Home visits, interviews with neighbors, background checks." She paused. "And if we find any cause for concern." The threat hung in the air between them. James stood straighter, meeting her gaze. "My daughter is my world, Miss Mitchell. Everything I do is to give her a safe, stable home. I welcome any investigation because it will only prove that—" Miss Mitchell made a few more notes, then handed him a card. "Expect contact from our office within the week. In the meantime, I strongly suggest supervising your daughter's activities more appropriately." As the black sedan disappeared down the driveway, Emma ran back to James, tears streaming down her face. She threw herself into his arms, her small body shaking with sobs. "Are they going to take me away?" she choked out against his chest. James held her tight, his heart breaking at the fear in her voice. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Never," he promised fiercely. "You hear me, Emma? Never. You're my daughter, and nothing, and nobody is ever going to change that." Emma buried her face in his shirt again, her tears slowly subsiding as he stroked her hair. James held her close, his mind already racing with plans to protect their future, but his voice remained steady and sure as he repeated, "Never, baby girl, never." James steered his pickup into the sheriff's office parking lot, his jaw set with determination. The morning sun glinted off the building's windows, but the warmth didn't reach his skin. He'd spent too many years in law enforcement not to recognize intimidation tactics when he saw them. The visit from Child Protective Services had crossed a line. Inside, the front desk's fluorescent lights hummed quietly. A dispatcher looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "Can I help you?" "James Walker to see Sheriff Dalton. It's important." She picked up her phone, murmured briefly, then nodded toward the hall. Second door on the right. Sheriff Dalton's office smelled of coffee and old paperwork. The man himself sat behind a cluttered desk, reading glasses perched on his nose. He gestured to a chair without looking up. "Mr. Walker." "Sheriff." James remained standing. "We need to talk about what's happening." "And what exactly would that be?" Dalton removed his glasses, his face a mask of bureaucratic indifference. "The harassment, the false reports to CPS, your deputies showing up at my property without cause." James kept his voice steady, professional. "I'm trying to give my daughter a stable home here." A movement caught his eye. Deputy Hensley lounged in the corner, arms crossed, a smirk playing at his lips. James hadn't noticed him when he'd entered. "Now, Mr. Walker," Sheriff Dalton sighed, spreading his hands. "We're just following protocol. When we receive reports..." "Reports about what?" James interrupted. "I've done nothing wrong. I have a clean record, served my country, worked for the FBI, claims that are mighty hard to verify." Hensley cut in, his voice dripping with mock concern. The sheriff shot Hensley a look, then turned back to James. "Listen, we have procedures we have to follow. When community members express concerns based on lies and prejudice," James said firmly. Dalton's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Walker, if you're here to make accusations..." "I'm here to clear things up, to understand why my daughter and I are being treated like criminals in our own home." "Nobody's treating you like criminals," Dalton said, but his eyes didn't quite meet James's. "We're just doing our jobs, keeping the peace." "Peace?" James felt his hands tighten into fists. He forced them to relax. "There was peace until your department started spreading suspicion about me." Hensley pushed off from the wall. "Maybe if you weren't so defensive..." "That's enough, Carl," Dalton cut in. To James, he said, "I understand you're frustrated, but these things take time to sort out. Just keep your nose clean, and I'm sure everything will settle down." James recognized the dismissal in Dalton's tone. The sheriff had already made up his mind, or someone had made it up for him. Either way, this visit was pointless. "Thank you for your time," James said stiffly, turning to leave. "Hey, Walker," Hensley called after him. "Give your little girl my regards." James didn't turn around. He wouldn't give the deputy the satisfaction of seeing how those words affected him. The drive home felt longer than usual. Main Street stretched before him, lined with familiar storefronts. But everything felt different now. Mrs. Peterson, who ran the flower shop, quickly looked away when he passed. Two men outside the hardware store stopped talking and stared coldly as he drove by. At the grocery store, a young mother hurriedly pulled her child closer as James walked past. The whispers followed him. "I heard he was discharged. Something about a violent incident. Can't trust those types." James kept his head high, his face calm, though each whisper felt like a physical blow. He'd faced danger before, dealt with hostile situations undercover. But this was different. This wasn't just about him. It was about Emma, about their future. The afternoon sun was setting by the time he pulled into their driveway. Emma was at a friend's house, one of the few parents who still allowed their children to play with her. The empty farmhouse seemed to echo with silence as he moved through the kitchen, mechanically preparing dinner. He set 2 plates on the old wooden table, trying to focus on normal things. Emma would be home soon. They'd eat together. He'd help her with her homework. Life would go on. The sudden flash of headlights through the window made him freeze. Blue and white lights spilled across the kitchen floor as a police cruiser pulled up outside. James stood absolutely still, watching through the window as the vehicle idled in his driveway, its engine humming in the gathering dusk. Seconds stretched into minutes. The cruiser just sat there, its presence an unspoken threat. James's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. In that moment, everything became crystal clear. This wasn't random harassment or simple prejudice. The timing was too perfect, the pressure too coordinated. Someone wanted them gone. Someone with authority, with influence in the community. Someone who could turn neighbors into strangers and make the law itself feel threatening. The cruiser's engine revved once, then it backed slowly out of the driveway, disappearing into the darkness. But its message lingered in the silent kitchen. You're not welcome here. We'll be watching. We'll keep coming. James stood in the quiet kitchen, his dinner growing cold, understanding with terrible clarity that this was just the beginning. They weren't just facing prejudice or small-town suspicion. They were up against something far more deliberate and dangerous. This was about power, about control, and someone was willing to destroy his life to maintain both. The morning sun painted long shadows across the school parking lot as James pulled up to Riverside Elementary. Emma sat quietly in the passenger seat, her backpack clutched tightly in her lap. She'd barely touched her breakfast. "Ready for another day, sweetheart?" James asked, keeping his voice light and steady. Emma nodded, but her small fingers gripped the backpack straps tighter. "Will you walk in with me again, Daddy?" "Of course." James stepped out of the truck, straightening his clean work shirt. He'd learned long ago that appearance mattered, especially when people were looking for faults. As they walked toward the entrance, the morning crowd of parents and children parted slightly. Some turned away, others whispered behind raised hands. A few kids pointed at Emma, then quickly looked away when James met their eyes. "Remember what we talked about?" James asked softly, placing a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. Emma lifted her chin, her voice quiet but firm. "We belong here, that's right." James smiled down at her, his heart swelling with pride. She was so brave, so much like her mother. Near the school doors, Mrs. Thompson, another parent, deliberately stepped aside as they approached, pulling her son away. The boy had been Emma's reading partner last week. "Good morning," James said politely, holding the door for them. Mrs. Thompson hurried past without responding, but her son waved quickly before being tugged along. Inside, the hallway buzzed with morning activity. Emma's teacher, Miss Roberts, stood outside her classroom, greeting students. When she saw them approaching, she smiled warmly. "Good morning, Emma. We're starting our science project today. I saved you a spot at the front table." "Thank you, Miss Roberts," Emma said, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. James squeezed Emma's hand. "Have a great day, Em. I'll pick you up after school." "Bye, Daddy." Emma hugged him quickly, then walked into the classroom with her head held high. Miss Roberts caught James's eye and gave him an encouraging nod. At least some people in town could see past the rumors. Back in his truck, James checked his watch. He had 2 hours before his shift at the church food pantry. Pastor Mike had offered him the volunteer position last Sunday, saying they needed strong arms to move boxes. James suspected the pastor had other motives, giving him a chance to show his character to the community. The church basement was cool and dimly lit when James arrived. Sarah, the elderly pantry coordinator, was already there, sorting canned goods. "Oh, thank goodness," she said when she saw him. "These boxes aren't getting any lighter, and my arthritis isn't getting any better." James rolled up his sleeves. "Just point me where you need me, ma'am." For the next hour, he moved boxes, organized shelves, and helped Sarah set up for the morning's food distribution. More volunteers trickled in, some eyeing him warily, others offering cautious greetings. "You're George Walker's boy, aren't you?" asked Bill, an older gentleman who'd been watching James stack boxes. "Yes, sir." "You knew my father?" Bill nodded slowly. "Good man, George. Helped me fix my tractor once. Wouldn't take a dime for it." He paused, studying James. "Shame how some folks are treating you. This town used to know better." Before James could respond, the first clients began arriving. He focused on his work, distributing food boxes, carrying groceries to cars for elderly visitors, always with a quiet, "God bless you," that his father had taught him. By noon, several volunteers were chatting with him, sharing stories about his father. Even Mrs. Miller, who'd crossed the street to avoid him yesterday, asked his advice about fixing a squeaky door. But not everyone was warming up. Through the basement window, James spotted Deputy Hensley talking to a group of men in the parking lot, gesturing toward the church. Soon after, one of the volunteers overheard someone say, "Can't believe they're letting him work here. What if he's casing the place?" James kept working, kept smiling, kept helping. His father always said actions spoke louder than words. After his shift, James drove home along the familiar country roads, allowing himself to feel a small measure of hope. Some people were starting to see past Hensley's lies. It would take time, but maybe. The thought died as he turned into his driveway. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as the barn came into view. Harsh red letters sprawled across the weathered wood. "Get out." James sat in the truck for a long moment, staring at the ugly words defacing his father's barn. The same barn where he'd learned to milk cows, where he'd had his first kiss with Emma's mother, where he'd promised his dying father he'd come home someday. Slowly, he got out and walked to the barn. The paint was still wet in places. This was recent. He touched one dripping letter, his fingers coming away red. Looking up at the vast blue sky, James closed his eyes. "Lord," he whispered, "give me strength, not for myself, but for Emma. Help me show her how to face hatred with dignity." Opening his eyes, he walked to the shed, gathered cleaning supplies, and filled a bucket with water. The work would be hard. The paint had already begun to set, but he'd faced worse challenges. As he scrubbed at the first letter, James thought of Emma's brave face that morning, holding her head high despite the whispers. If his 10-year-old daughter could show such courage, he could certainly do no less. The sun beat down as he worked, his shirt soaking with sweat. The paint was stubborn, requiring multiple passes with different cleaners. But slowly, steadily, the hateful message began to fade. James paused to wipe his brow, looking at his progress. The get was almost gone, leaving only ghost-like traces on the old wood. Like the prejudice in town, it would take time and effort to erase completely. But he would keep working, keep believing, keep showing through his actions what kind of man he really was. For Emma, for his father's memory, for the truth. The bucket needed refilling, so James walked back to the house. His arms ached, and hours of work still lay ahead, but he felt a strange peace. Sometimes the only way forward was through one stroke at a time, one day at a time, one heart at a time. The community hall buzzed with tension as people filed in, their whispers echoing off the wooden walls. Old friends who normally chatted now sat divided, some clustering near Deputy Hensley at the front, others spreading out in small, uncertain groups. James chose a seat near the back, grateful when Pastor Miller settled beside him with a reassuring nod. Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order, his gavel cutting through the murmurs. "Folks, we're here to address concerns about—" He paused, clearly uncomfortable, "about recent developments in our community." Deputy Hensley didn't wait for an invitation. He strode to the podium, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Good people of River's Edge, I stand before you tonight because I cannot, in good conscience, stay silent." His voice carried through the hall, practiced and sharp. "We have among us someone who poses a risk to our peaceful town." James sat straight-backed, his face calm despite the eyes that turned his way. He'd faced worse in his FBI days, but this was different. This was about Emma's future. "This man claims to be FBI," Hensley continued, his lip curling. "Claims to be here for peaceful reasons. But what do we really know about James Walker? Where's he been all these years? What's he running from?" Martha Jenkins, who owned the bakery, stood up. "Now wait just a minute. I knew James's father. Harold Walker was as honest as they come." "People change," Hensley shot back. "And sons aren't always like their fathers." More voices joined in, the meeting descending into chaos. "My girl says his daughter is sweet as can be," called out Tom Wilson, the hardware store owner. "But what about those police cars at his place?" someone else countered. "Must be something wrong. Those were there because Hensley sent them." Pastor Miller's voice cut through the noise, firm but measured. Mayor Thompson banged his gavel again. "Order, please! Mr. Walker, would you like to address these concerns?" James rose slowly, his movements deliberate. The room fell silent as he walked to the podium, passing Hensley who refused to meet his eyes. For a moment he simply stood there, looking out at the faces of his neighbors. Some hostile, some friendly, many uncertain. "I was born in this town," he began, his voice quiet but clear. "In the farmhouse where my daughter and I now live. My father taught me to plant straight rows in that soil, to help neighbors when they needed it, to serve something bigger than myself." He paused, letting the words settle. "That's why I joined the military, why I later served in the FBI, not to run from anything, but to protect people, just like my father protected this community for 40 years as your town doctor." A few heads nodded. Old Mrs. Peterson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, likely remembering how Dr. Walker had cared for her late husband. "I'm here now because this is home, because my daughter Emma deserves to know the place her grandfather loved, where her roots are." James's voice grew stronger. "I've faced real dangers in my work. I've seen what true threats look like. And I can tell you, the only threat to this community is the fear that's being stirred up to divide us." Several people shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Hensley, who stood rigid with anger. "My door is open to any of you who want to know the truth about who I am. Come by the farm, talk to Emma, see how we're fixing up the place, just like my father would have wanted." James looked directly at Hensley now. "I'm not going anywhere. This is our home." He returned to his seat amid mixed reactions. Some people clapped softly, while others muttered among themselves. The division in the room was still visible, but something had shifted. A few who'd been sitting with Hensley's group moved to different seats. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. "Well, I think we've heard enough for tonight. Let's remember we're all neighbors here." As people filed out, conversations continued in hushed tones. Some nodded to James as they passed, while others hurried by without looking at him. Pastor Miller stayed by his side, his presence a steady comfort. "The truth has a way of coming to light," Pastor Miller said quietly, patting James' shoulder. James nodded, but caught Hensley's glare from across the room. The deputy's face was dark with determination, his jaw set in a hard line. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. "Thank you for being here, Pastor," James said, his eyes still on Hensley's retreating form. "Always," Pastor Miller replied. "Always." The morning sun filtered through the classroom windows as Emma sat at her desk, trying to focus on her math worksheet. She could hear the whispers behind her, words that stung like paper cuts. "My dad says her father is dangerous," one boy muttered. "My mom told me to stay away from her," another girl added, not bothering to lower her voice. Emma's pencil trembled slightly in her hand, but she remembered her father's words from that morning.
"Sometimes the bravest thing is to be kind when others aren't."
She took a deep breath and continued solving her problems, the numbers swimming before her eyes. During recess, Emma sat alone on a bench near the playground, watching other kids play Foursquare. She pulled out her lunch, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich her father had carefully cut into triangles, with a little note that read, "You're my superhero," tucked inside the wrapper. 3 girls from her class, Sarah, Madison, and Jenny, walked past, giggling and pointing. They were the ones who had been whispering the loudest in class. Emma felt her chest tighten, but instead of shrinking away, she smiled and held up half of her sandwich. "Would you like to share?" she asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My dad makes the best PB&Js." The girls stopped, exchanging confused looks. This wasn't the reaction they'd expected. "Why are you being nice?" Madison asked suspiciously. "We weren't nice to you." Emma shrugged, still holding out the sandwich. "Because being mean back won't make anything better. Plus, I have cookies too." She pulled out a small bag of chocolate chip cookies she'd helped her father bake the night before. Sarah, the tallest of the 3, took a tentative step forward. "Really? You'd share with us?" "Sure," Emma said, scooting over to make room on the bench. "We could all play something together after. Maybe jump rope? I saw you guys doing double dutch yesterday." "I've always wanted to learn." Slowly, cautiously, the girls sat down. Emma broke her sandwich into pieces, passing them around along with the cookies. As they ate, the awkwardness began to melt away. "These cookies are really good," Jenny admitted, brushing crumbs from her shirt. "Thanks. My dad taught me how to bake them. He says the secret is to add extra vanilla," Emma shared, her eyes bright. Madison tilted her head, considering. "But my mom said your dad is." She trailed off, looking embarrassed. "My dad is just my dad," Emma said simply. He makes me lunch every day, helps me with homework, and tells terrible dad jokes. Want to hear one? Without waiting for an answer, she continued, What do you call a bear with no teeth? The girls looked at each other. A gummy bear, Emma delivered the punchline with a giggle. Despite themselves, the girls laughed. The tension broken, Sarah stood up and held out her hand. Want to learn double Dutch? We can teach you. For the rest of recess, the playground echoed with their laughter as Emma learned to jump rope, stumbling and getting tangled but always getting back up with a smile. Other kids began to drift over, drawn by their fun. Later that afternoon, Lily's mother, Mrs. Chen, approached Emma as she waited for her father after school. Emma recognized the uncertainty in her eyes. It was a look she'd grown used to seeing from adults. Emma, Mrs. Chen said softly, Lily hasn't stopped talking about you since Sunday school. Would you like to come over for cookies tomorrow after school? If your father agrees, of course. Emma's face lit up. Really? I'd love to. She spotted her father's truck pulling up and pointed. We can ask him right now. James walked over, his posture careful but friendly. Mrs. Chen's smile wavered but didn't disappear as she repeated her invitation. That's very kind of you, James said warmly. Emma would love that. Please, you're welcome to come in for coffee when you pick her up, Mrs. Chen added, surprising herself with the offer. My husband David would like to meet you properly. The next afternoon, Emma sat at the Chen's kitchen table with Lily, decorating sugar cookies with colorful frosting. Mrs. Chen watched from the counter as the girls chatted and laughed, her preconceptions about the Walkers slowly crumbling in the face of Emma's gentle spirit. When James came to pick Emma up, Mr. Chen met him at the door with a firm handshake. Over coffee, they discovered they had both served in the military, though in different branches. The conversation flowed easier after that, touching on shared experiences and mutual understanding. As the sun began to set, James and Emma headed home. Lily ran out to the driveway, calling after them. Can Emma come over again tomorrow? That evening, James sat on the old wooden porch swing, watching Emma and Lily chase fireflies in the growing dusk. Their giggles floated through the warm air as they darted across the lawn, mason jars in hand. The setting sun painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks, making the scene look almost magical. Lily's parents stood chatting with James, their earlier reservations forgotten, as they discussed plans for a weekend barbecue. Mrs. Chen had brought over a plate of leftover cookies, insisting the girls needed energy for their firefly hunt. James watched as Emma showed Lily how to gently catch a firefly and release it again. His daughter's patience and kindness, even in the face of earlier rejection, filled his heart with pride. That's my girl, he whispered, a smile playing at his lips as he watched her demonstrate once again the gentle spirit that could turn enemies into friends. The fireflies danced around the girls, their lights blinking like tiny stars come down to earth. In that moment, watching his daughter's joy and resilience, James felt a deep sense of peace. Emma had found her own way to fight back against prejudice, not with anger or bitterness, but with an open heart and unwavering kindness. Thunder cracked across the dark sky as rain pounded against the farmhouse windows. Emma sat at her desk, working on her math homework while James prepared dinner in the kitchen. The weather report had warned of severe storms, but this was turning into something fierce. A flash of lightning illuminated the entire kitchen, followed by a deafening boom that made Emma jump. It's okay, sweetheart, James called out, stirring the pot of soup on the stove. Just Mother Nature putting on a show. The wind howled outside, rattling the old window frames. James glanced at his watch. 7:30 p.m. The storm was supposed to peak around midnight. He'd already checked their emergency supplies and flashlights, just in case. Suddenly, a faint sound carried through the drumming rain. James paused, tilting his head to listen more carefully. There it was again, a cry for help. Emma, he said firmly, stay inside. He grabbed his raincoat from the hook by the door and switched on the porch light. The beam cut through sheets of rain, revealing rushing water where their driveway should be. The creek behind their property had overflowed. Another cry pierced the night, closer this time. James squinted through the downpour and saw movement near the flooded creek bed. His heart stopped when he made out what it was, a small figure clinging to a fallen tree branch. Daddy? Emma appeared at the window, pressing her hands against the glass. Her eyes widened as she watched her father wade into the rising water. "Stay there and pray, Em," James called back, fighting against the current that already reached his knees. The water was ice cold, but adrenaline kept him moving forward. As he got closer, he recognized the child, Tommy Henderson, their closest neighbor's 8-year-old son. "Hold on, Tommy," James shouted over the storm. "I'm coming." The boy's face was white with terror as he clung to the branch. "Help, please!" he cried, his voice trembling. James calculated quickly. The current was strong, but he'd trained for water rescues during his FBI days. He moved deliberately, testing each step before shifting his weight. One wrong move could send both of them downstream. From the farmhouse window, Emma clasped her hands together, whispering urgent prayers. "Please, God, help Daddy save Tommy. Please keep them safe." The water rose to James's waist as he reached the fallen tree. Tommy's grip was weakening, his small fingers slipping on the wet bark. "Tommy, look at me," James said calmly, though his heart hammered in his chest. "I'm going to count to 3, then reach for you. Can you be brave for me?" Tommy nodded, teeth chattering. 1, 2, 3. James lunged forward just as Tommy's fingers gave way. He caught the boy's arm and pulled him close, shielding him from the current. Tommy wrapped his arms around James's neck, sobbing into his shoulder. "I got you, son. I got you," James murmured, holding Tommy tight with one arm while using the other to fight their way back to shore. Each step was a battle against the rushing water, but James's military training kicked in. Slow, steady, deliberate. Finally, his feet found solid ground. Emma was already at the door, holding it open as James carried Tommy inside. They were both soaking wet and shivering. "Emma, get the blankets from the hall closet," James directed, setting Tommy down on the couch. She rushed off and returned with an armful of warm blankets while James pulled out his phone. "Hello, Mrs. Henderson." "Yes, Tommy's safe. He's here with us." James explained the situation while wrapping Tommy in blankets. The boy's mother's relief was audible even from across the room. Within minutes, flashing lights appeared through the rain as emergency vehicles arrived. The Hendersons weren't far behind, having called 911 when they discovered Tommy missing. Mrs. Henderson burst through the door and gathered her son in her arms, crying and thanking James over and over. The local news crew showed up shortly after, eager to cover the dramatic rescue. James tried to downplay it, but Tommy's parents insisted on telling everyone how he'd risked his life to save their son. Camera flashes lit up the living room as photographers captured James and Emma standing together, Tommy and his parents beside them, everyone smiling with relief and gratitude. The next morning, their story was front-page news. "Local father's heroic rescue. Former FBI agent saves child from flood," read the headline, accompanied by a photo of James and Emma. The article praised his quick thinking and courage, mentioning his military service and FBI background with respect rather than suspicion. People stopped by all day bringing food and thanks. Even those who had been coldest to them seemed to see James differently now. The paper called him a man of courage, and for once, the town seemed to agree. That evening, James and Emma sat at their kitchen table, sharing hot cocoa topped with mini marshmallows. Emma had counted 17 people who'd visited to shake her father's hand. She beamed at him over her mug, chocolate mustache on her upper lip. "Maybe they'll see the real you now, Daddy," she said hopefully. James smiled at his daughter but glanced out the window, where the storm had left debris scattered across their yard. Something in his expression was uneasy, despite the warmth of the moment they shared. James noticed the dark police cruiser in his rearview mirror for the 3rd time that morning, first at the post office, then near the church, and now as he drove Emma to school. He kept his expression calm, not wanting to worry his daughter, but his jaw tightened slightly. "Did you remember your science project?" he asked, glancing at Emma in the passenger seat. "Yes, Daddy. Mrs. Roberts is going to love my plant experiment." Emma hugged her cardboard display to her chest, beaming with pride. After dropping Emma off, James headed to Morgan's Hardware on Main Street. The bell chimed as he pushed open the door, and old Mr. Morgan looked up from behind the counter. "Morning, James. What can I help you with today?" "Need some wood sealant for the barn door," James replied, moving between the narrow aisles. The store smelled of sawdust and metal, familiar and comforting. The bell chimed again. Heavy boots scraped across the wooden floor. Well, look who we have here," Deputy Carl Hensley's voice dripped with mock friendliness. He deliberately bumped into a display of paint cans as he approached, making them rattle. James continued examining the sealant bottles, choosing not to engage. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay silent. I'm talking to you, Walker. Hensley moved closer, his badge catching the fluorescent light. Heard you've been spreading lies about me at church, telling folks I'm harassing you. Excuse me, Deputy, James said quietly, trying to step around him. I need to get these supplies home. Hensley blocked his path, chest puffed out. You think you're better than us, don't you, with your fancy FBI stories? But I know what you really are. Trouble. Mr. Morgan called from the counter. Now, Carl, leave the man be. He's just shopping. Stay out of this, old man. Hensley snapped, then turned back to James. Come on, tough guy. Show us what you're really made of. James remained still, his voice steady. I'm not looking for trouble, Deputy. Just trying to fix up my father's farm. Your father? Hensley sneered. He was nothing but a fool who trusted the wrong people. Like father, like son, I guess. James's hands tightened on the bottle of sealant, but he kept his composure. Please, step aside. Instead, Hensley shoved James hard, sending him stumbling backward into a shelf. Tools clattered to the floor. What's wrong? FBI man can't handle a little push? Deputy, stop this, Mr. Morgan warned, reaching for his phone. James straightened up slowly, his eyes never leaving Hensley's face. Don't do this. Hensley grinned, ugly and mean. Do what? This? He shoved James again, harder. This time James caught himself against the shelf. But Hensley wasn't done. He grabbed James's shirt, pulling him close. Come on, hit me. Give me a reason. Daddy? Emma's voice cut through the tension like a knife. She stood in the doorway, her science project clutched to her chest. School must have let out early for the storm warning. Emma! Stay back! James called, trying to keep his voice calm. Hensley's grip tightened. Yeah, Emma, watch your daddy show his true colors. In that moment, several things happened at once. Hensley pulled back his fist. James raised his hands defensively. The deputy suddenly threw himself backward, crashing into the paint cans with an exaggerated yell of pain. Assault! He attacked me! Hensley shouted, rolling on the floor. Someone call it in! That's not true, Emma cried. Daddy didn't do anything! But Hensley was already speaking into his radio, calling for backup. Within minutes, 2 police cars screeched to a halt outside. Officers burst through the door, hands on their weapons. He's lying, Mr. Morgan protested. I saw the whole thing. Deputy Hensley started it. But Hensley was already on his feet, pulling out his handcuffs. James Walker, you're under arrest for assaulting a police officer. No. Emma dropped her science project, running toward James. Please don't take my daddy. James's heart broke as an officer held Emma back. It's okay, sweetheart. Everything's going to be okay. Call Pastor Miller. He'll help you. Daddy, please don't take him. Emma's screams echoed through the store as Hensley roughly cuffed James's hands behind his back. A small crowd had gathered outside the hardware store. James caught glimpses of shocked faces as Hensley paraded him to the police car. Some looked away, others shook their heads. A few pulled out phones to record the scene. I want everyone to see what happens when you mess with law enforcement, Hensley announced loudly, shoving James into the back seat. Through the window, James watched Emma collapse into Mrs. Morgan's arms, sobbing. His daughter's cries followed him all the way to the station. The booking process passed in a blur. Fingerprints, mugshot, empty questions he answered in a hollow voice. Finally, they led him to a cold cell at the end of a narrow hallway. The metal door clanged shut behind him. James sank onto the thin mattress, his head bowing under the weight of it all. The cell was silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and his own breathing. Lord, he whispered, his voice barely audible in the empty cell. Don't let her lose faith in me. His prayer lingered in the sterile air as he thought of Emma's face, her terrified screams. Would this be what broke her trust in him? Would this be what finally destroyed the careful life he'd tried to build for them? James closed his eyes, his whispered prayer becoming more urgent. Don't let her lose faith in me. Please, don't let her lose faith in me. The cell's silence swallowed his words as evening shadows crept across the floor. The news of James Walker's arrest spread through town like wildfire. By noon, whispers had turned to shouts. and rumors twisted into dark tales. Emma sat in Pastor Miller's office, her small frame shaking with sobs that seemed too big for her body. The pastor's wife, Mrs. Miller, held her close, stroking her hair with gentle hands. "I don't want to leave, Daddy," Emma choked out between hiccups. Her fingers clutched a worn tissue, twisting it into knots. "They can't take me away. They can't." Pastor Miller knelt before her, his kind eyes filled with concern. "We won't let that happen, Emma. Your father's a good man, and the truth will come out." The door opened, and Sarah Thompson from Child Protective Services stepped in, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. Emma pressed closer to Mrs. Miller, fear etched across her young face. "Given the circumstances," Miss Thompson began, her voice professionally detached, "we need to discuss temporary placement for Emma while we investigate Mr. Walker's situation." She shuffled through papers in her manila folder. "The assault of a police officer is a serious charge." "It was a setup," Emma burst out, her voice cracking. "Deputy Hensley pushed Daddy first. He's been mean to us since we got here." Pastor Miller stood, his normally gentle demeanor hardening slightly. "Miss Thompson, I've known James Walker since he was Emma's age. His father was a pillar of this community. There has to be another way." "The law is clear," Miss Thompson replied. "With no immediate family available and Mr. Walker in custody, we have to ensure Emma's safety." Emma's shoulders slumped, defeat washing over her small face. "Mrs. Miller hugged her tighter, speaking up. "What if we took temporary custody? We've known Emma since they arrived, and she'd be comfortable with us." Miss Thompson consulted her papers again. "That could be arranged, pending a home study. But it would only be temporary until we complete our investigation." At the jail, James sat on the hard metal bench, his head in his hands. Sheriff Dalton approached his cell, keys jangling. "Your lawyer's here," the sheriff said gruffly. "And Walker. For what it's worth, some of us have doubts about Hensley's story." James looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, but determined. "Sheriff, you know this isn't right. That man has been targeting my family since we arrived." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "A lot of folks are starting to ask questions, but Hensley's got friends in high places." James's lawyer, a court-appointed defender named Mike Richards, waited in the consultation room. His weathered face showed concern as he spread files across the table. "It's not good, James," Richards said frankly. "Hensley's claiming you attacked him unprovoked. He's got 2 witnesses backing his story." "They're lying," James said quietly. "He cornered me in the hardware store, started pushing buttons about Emma, about my wife. His voice caught, but I never threw a punch. He staged the whole thing." Richards nodded slowly. "I believe you. But proving it." He shuffled through more papers. "There's something else. CPS is moving to suspend your custody rights pending investigation." The words hit James like physical blows. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "They can't take my daughter. She's all I have left." "Pastor Miller and his wife have offered to take temporary custody," Richards explained. "It's better than foster care, James. At least she'll be with people who know the truth." Back at the church, Emma sat alone in the sanctuary, her small figure dwarfed by the empty pews. She pulled a crumpled crayon drawing from her pocket, a picture of her and her father in front of their farmhouse, stick figures smiling beneath a bright yellow sundae. She'd slipped it into his coat pocket that morning before everything fell apart. Pastor Miller found her there, sitting in the fading afternoon light that streamed through the stained glass windows. He sat beside her, his presence steady and comforting. "Your daddy is the strongest person I know," he said softly. "And do you know why?" Emma shook her head, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "Because he never lets hatred win. Even now he's fighting with love and truth, not anger." The pastor smiled gently. "That's real strength." In his cell, James held the crayon drawing Emma had hidden in his pocket. The paper was damp with tears he couldn't hold back anymore. The darkness pressed in around him, heavy with the weight of everything he stood to lose. "I can't lose her too," he whispered into the silence, his voice breaking. The image of his daughter's face, terrified as they led him away in handcuffs, haunted him. First his wife, now possibly Emma. The thought was unbearable. The night deepened, and James sat alone in his cell, clutching the drawing like a lifeline. Outside, the town slept, unaware that their prejudice and fear had nearly destroyed a family. But in the darkness of that cell, a father's love burned fierce and unbreakable, even as tears slipped down his face. I can't lose her, too. Mark Jensen's footsteps echoed softly through the empty jail corridor. The night shift was quiet, with only the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional crackle of his radio breaking the silence. He paused at James Walker's cell, his hand resting on his belt, watching the man who sat perfectly still on the thin mattress. James didn't move, didn't even look up. His shoulders were straight, his head bowed, and his hands folded in his lap. There was something about his posture that spoke of strength rather than defeat. Mark had seen plenty of men in cells before. They usually paced or cursed or begged. But James Walker just waited. "Mr. Walker?" Mark's voice came out softer than he intended. James lifted his head slowly. His eyes were tired but clear, holding no anger or fear. "Deputy Jensen." Mark shifted his weight, glancing down the empty hallway. "Sir, something's not right about all this. I was there at the hardware store. I saw what really happened." A flicker of interest crossed James's face, but his voice remained steady. "And what did you see, Deputy?" "Hensley pushed you first." He was trying to get a reaction. Mark stepped closer to the bars, lowering his voice. "And that injury he's claiming? I watched him bang his own arm against the patrol car door after he put you in the back." James nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he already knew. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because." Mark swallowed hard, his rookie badge feeling heavy on his chest. "Because this isn't what I signed up for. This isn't justice." The overhead lights buzzed, casting harsh shadows across James's face. "Justice can be hard to find in small towns, son, especially when people don't want to see it. I've been watching," Mark continued, his words tumbling out faster now. "Hensley's been targeting you since you arrived. The trespassing call, the CPS report, all of it. It's not random." James stood up, moving to the bars with a quiet grace that reminded Mark of the big cats he'd seen at the zoo. Contained power, carefully controlled. "Why does it matter to you?" "My father was a cop," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He always said the badge means protecting people, not hurting them. What Hensley's doing, it's wrong." A long moment passed between them. Then James spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "You could get yourself in trouble, Deputy Jensen. I know. But I can't. Just." Mark ran a hand through his hair. "Give me an hour. I need to check something." Without waiting for a response, Mark hurried to the records room. His hands shook slightly as he used his key to unlock the filing cabinet. Hensley's case files were thick with incident reports, most of them involving minorities or outsiders passing through town. A pattern emerged: harassment disguised as routine stops, complaints that mysteriously disappeared, witnesses who changed their stories. Then he found it, James Walker's file. But it wasn't just the recent complaints. There were old FBI credentials, newspaper clippings about undercover operations, commendations for bravery, pictures of James, in uniform, receiving medals. Letters of recommendation that spoke of his integrity, his courage, his unwavering commitment to justice. Mark's heart pounded as he read. This wasn't some troublemaker. This was a decorated agent who'd risked his life to protect others. And now he was sitting in a cell, separated from his daughter, because of one man's prejudice. The young deputy gathered the evidence carefully, making copies of key documents. His palms were sweaty as he returned to James's cell, checking twice to make sure no one else was around. "Mr. Walker," he whispered urgently, "I found your real file, the FBI credentials, your service record. Everything Hensley tried to bury. He's been falsifying reports, twisting evidence. I can prove it." James moved to the bars again, his eyes intense. "That's dangerous information, son." "I know." Mark clutched the papers tightly. "But I also know what will happen if I don't use it. They'll take Emma away. They'll destroy everything you've built here, and then they'll do it to someone else." A shadow of pain crossed James's face at the mention of his daughter. "Why risk your career for me? You don't even know me." Mark straightened his shoulders. "Because my father also taught me that sometimes doing what's right means standing alone. And sir, you shouldn't have to stand alone anymore." James studied the young deputy's face for a long moment. Then he asked quietly, "What's your plan?" "I've got copies of everything. The real reports, the falsified ones, Hensley's pattern of harassment, evidence that he staged the hardware store incident. Mark's voice grew stronger with each word. "I can take this to the state police. Bypass the local chain of command entirely." He hesitated, then added softly, "But if I do this, if I go against Hensley, there's no going back. He has friends in high places. I'll probably lose my badge." James reached through the bars, placing a steady hand on Mark's shoulder. "Son, are you sure about this?" Mark looked into the eyes of the man before him. A father fighting for his daughter. A warrior who'd never lost his honor. A stranger who'd shown more integrity and silence than Hensley had in years of swagger and threats. "Yes, sir," Mark whispered. "I think I can prove you're innocent, but it might cost me everything." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of what was to come. James's hand tightened briefly on Mark's shoulder. A gesture of understanding, of shared purpose, of quiet courage in the face of injustice. Neither man spoke again. They didn't need to. In the dim light of the jail corridor, a bridge had been built between youth and experience, between duty and justice, between what was easy and what was right. The moment stretched, filled with the quiet strength of two men choosing to stand for truth, no matter the cost. Mark Jensen's hands trembled as he dialed Pastor Miller's number from the privacy of his patrol car. It was well past midnight, but he knew the pastor would answer. He always did for those in need. "Pastor Miller, it's Deputy Jensen. I'm sorry to call so late, but it's about James Walker." The pastor's voice came through clear and steady. "Mark, what's happening?" "I need your help. Can we meet? Somewhere private?" Mark glanced over his shoulder, paranoid about being seen even in the empty parking lot. 20 minutes later, Mark sat in Pastor Miller's study, the warm lamplight casting long shadows across the book-lined walls. The pastor listened intently as Mark laid out what he discovered about James's case. "I've seen Hensley's files," Mark explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "The reports against James, they're all fabricated. And there's more. I found James's real FBI credentials. He's not just any agent, he's decorated. Multiple commendations for bravery." Pastor Miller leaned forward in his chair. "We need more allies. Let me make some calls." By dawn, they had assembled a small group in the church basement. 2 veterans who'd stood by James at the town meeting, a retired school teacher who remembered James as a boy, and Sarah Thompson, the mother of the child James had saved from the flood. "Hensley's been doing this for years," one of the veterans, Bill Matthews, growled. "Pushing people around, spreading lies, but nobody's had the guts to stand up to him. Until now," Sarah added firmly. "My Tommy would be dead if it weren't for James Walker. I'll testify to that." Throughout the day, they worked carefully, gathering statements and documenting patterns of harassment. The retired teacher brought out old newspaper clippings about James's father, showing the family's deep roots in the community. The veterans compiled a list of incidents where Hensley had abused his authority. Mark's heart pounded every time he entered the station. He waited for quiet moments, carefully photocopying relevant files when no one was watching. His hands shook as he documented falsified reports, tampered evidence, and a pattern of targeting minorities and newcomers. "If Hensley catches me," Mark confided to Pastor Miller during a tense meeting, "my career is over." The pastor squeezed his shoulder. "Sometimes doing the right thing comes at a cost, son, but God sees your courage." The evidence mounted. Witness statements about Hensley's provocation at the hardware store. Security camera footage showing James hadn't initiated the confrontation. Documentation of Hensley's history of false arrests. Mark organized everything meticulously, building an undeniable case. Late that night, Mark sat in his car outside Sheriff Dalton's house, the thick envelope heavy in his hands. The street was dark and quiet, crickets chirping in the warm evening air. He'd chosen this moment carefully. Hensley was off duty, and the sheriff's wife was away visiting family. Taking a deep breath, Mark approached the front door and knocked. Sheriff Dalton answered in casual clothes, surprise crossing his face at seeing his youngest deputy. "Jensen? What brings you here at this hour?" Mark held out the envelope, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Sir, there's something you need to see. About Deputy Hensley and James Walker." The sheriff's expression darkened as he began reviewing the contents under his porch light. His frown deepened with each page he turned. Photos, statements, evidence logs, falsified reports, the truth laid bare in black and white. "How long have you been gathering this?" Dalton asked quietly. "Long enough to know it's all true, sir." Mark stood straight, ready to face whatever consequences came. Sheriff Dalton stared at the evidence for a long moment, then looked up at his young deputy. The weight of responsibility and truth settled heavily in his eyes. "Come inside, Mark. We need to talk about this." As Mark followed him into the house, he saw the sheriff's hands tighten on the envelope. There would be no more looking the other way. The truth had finally found its voice. The county courthouse buzzed with whispers as Deputy Carl Hensley took the stand. His police uniform was crisp and pressed, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He wore a slight smirk as he raised his right hand to be sworn in. Emma sat in the front row beside Pastor Miller, her small hand gripping his tightly. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying, but she kept her chin up, just like her father had taught her. James sat at the defense table in his best suit, the one he'd worn to church that first Sunday, looking tired, but composed. "Deputy Hensley," the prosecutor began, "please tell us about your encounter with the defendant on the day in question." Hensley leaned forward, his voice dripping with false concern. "Well, I was just doing my regular patrol when I noticed Mr. Walker acting suspiciously at Johnson's Hardware. When I approached him to ask some routine questions, he became aggressive and violent." James's attorney shifted in his chair, but before he could object, Hensley continued. "As an officer of the law, I had to protect myself and the community. Mr. Walker has shown nothing but contempt for authority since arriving in our town." Emma's lower lip trembled. Pastor Miller squeezed her hand and whispered, "Have faith, little one." "And you've had previous encounters with the defendant?" the prosecutor asked. "Oh, yes." Hensley's voice grew louder, more confident. "Multiple complaints from concerned citizens, reports of suspicious behavior. His story about being FBI? Complete fabrication. We checked. No record of service." The courtroom murmured. James remained still, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "In fact," Hensley continued, straightening his shoulders, "I believe Mr. Walker poses a serious threat to—" "Your Honor." The sharp call cut through the testimony. Sheriff Dalton stood in the back of the courtroom, a thick manila envelope in his hands. Mark Jensen stood slightly behind him, looking pale but determined. "I apologize for the interruption," the sheriff said, walking forward, "but I have evidence that must be presented immediately." The judge peered over her glasses. "This is highly irregular, Sheriff." "I understand, Your Honor, but this concerns not only the defendant's innocence, but serious misconduct within my department." Hensley's smirk vanished. "Now wait, just a minute." "Deputy Hensley, you will remain silent," the judge ordered sharply. She nodded to the sheriff. "Proceed." Sheriff Dalton approached the bench, handing over the envelope. "These documents include Mr. Walker's verified FBI credentials, his military service record, and multiple commendations for bravery in the line of duty." Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the judge examined the papers. Emma sat up straighter, her eyes wide. "Furthermore," the sheriff continued, his voice heavy, "we have evidence of systematic harassment and false reports filed by Deputy Hensley, not just against Miss Walker but several other citizens over the past few years." Hensley jumped to his feet. "That's a lie. You can't—" "Sit down, deputy," the judge commanded. She held up a document. "This appears to be an official FBI commendation for Mr. Walker's undercover work breaking up a human trafficking ring. And here's his Purple Heart from his military service." The prosecutor stood, looking flustered. "Your Honor, I was not aware—" "Because Deputy Hensley deliberately buried these records," Sheriff Dalton interrupted. "Deputy Jensen discovered the files hidden in Hensley's desk, along with evidence of bribes and falsified reports." All eyes turned to Mark Jensen, who stood straighter despite his obvious nervousness. Hensley's face had turned an ugly shade of red. "This is all a setup," Hensley shouted. "You can't trust—" "Officers," the judge called sharply. Two bailiffs moved quickly to either side of Hensley. "Deputy Carl Hensley, you are hereby detained pending an investigation into these allegations." As the bailiffs led a protesting Hensley away, the judge turned to James. Her stern expression had softened. "Mr. Walker, I have seen more than enough evidence to clear you of all charges. Furthermore, I want to extend the court's sincere apology for this gross miscarriage of justice." Emma couldn't contain herself any longer. She broke free from Pastor Miller's grip and ran forward, tears streaming down her face. "Daddy, Daddy!" James stood just in time to catch his daughter as she launched herself into his arms. He lifted her up, holding her close as she sobbed into his shoulder. "I knew you were good, Daddy," she cried. "I knew it all along." James closed his eyes, his own tears falling freely now as he held his daughter. The courtroom had erupted in conversation, but he barely heard it. All that mattered was the precious weight in his arms and the knowledge that their nightmare was finally over. Pastor Miller approached, placing a gentle hand on James's shoulder. Sheriff Dalton and Deputy Jensen stood nearby, both looking relieved and somewhat ashamed. But James could only focus on Emma's words, whispered over and over against his neck.
"I knew you were good, Daddy. I knew you were good."
The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Sheriff Dalton emerged, his weathered face set in grim determination. Behind him, 2 officers led Deputy Carl Hensley out in handcuffs, his previously pristine uniform now wrinkled and his badge conspicuously absent. The gathered crowd gasped collectively. Many of the same people who had whispered accusations about James now watched in stunned silence. Hensley's face was a mask of fury as he was escorted down the steps. "This is ridiculous," he snarled, struggling against the restraints. "I served this town for 15 years. The sheriff's voice cut through the murmurs. "And you betrayed that trust every single day?" He turned to address the assembled townspeople, his voice carrying across the courthouse lawn. "Deputy Hensley is under arrest for multiple charges, including abuse of power, falsifying police reports, and criminal harassment." James stood quietly at the top of the steps, Emma's small hand wrapped tightly in his. The same people who had crossed the street to avoid him just days ago now couldn't meet his eyes. Mrs. Thompson, the grocery store owner who had watched him so suspiciously, was the first to step forward. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice trembling, I'm so sorry. We should have known better. Should have asked questions instead of just believing." She twisted her hands in her apron, tears welling in her eyes. One by one, others stepped forward. Mr. Peterson, who had pulled his children away when James walked past. The hardware store owner who had watched silently during Hensley's confrontation. Each carried the weight of their silence, their complicity in the persecution of an innocent man. James, Tom Bradley, his nearest neighbor, spoke up. "I served with your father in Vietnam. He was the finest man I knew, and I dishonored his memory by doubting you. Can you ever forgive us?" Emma squeezed her father's hand, looking up at him with pride as he stepped forward to address the crowd. The setting sun caught the silver at his temples, highlighting the quiet dignity in his bearing. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but carried clearly across the hushed gathering. "There's nothing to forgive," James said, his words measured and sincere. "Fear and mistrust can poison any community, but they don't have to define us. My prayer isn't for revenge or even justice. It's for healing, for all of us." Several people wiped tears from their eyes. Pastor Miller, standing nearby, nodded in approval. "What matters now," James continued, "is that we learn from this, that we remember to look past our assumptions and see each other's humanity. Every person deserves that chance." Lily's mother stepped forward, pulling Emma into a tight hug. "Your daddy's a good man, sweetheart. We were blind not to see it." Mark Jensen, the young deputy who had risked his career to expose the truth, approached James with an outstretched hand. "Sir, I want you to know your example, your dignity through all this. It reminded me why I became an officer in the first place." The crowd began to disperse, but not before many stepped forward to shake James's hand or offer quiet words of apology. Even Sheriff Dalton approached, removing his hat respectfully. "Mr. Walker," he said, "I failed you in this town by not investigating sooner. I'd be honored if you'd consider serving on our newly formed Civilian Oversight Committee. We need men of your character." As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, James and Emma began their walk home. The same street that had once felt hostile now held a different energy. Neighbors waved from their porches. Cars slowed as they passed, drivers offering friendly nods. A small group of townspeople followed at a respectful distance, their soft words of support carrying on the evening breeze. Emma skipped alongside her father, her face beaming with joy and vindication. "See, Daddy?" she whispered, squeezing his hand. "I told you they'd see the real you." The crowd that had gathered outside the courthouse began to disperse, but not before breaking into gentle applause, not the thunderous kind that demanded attention, but the soft, respectful kind that acknowledged a wrong had been righted. As father and daughter walked down Main Street, past the hardware store where Hensley had tried to provoke James just days ago. People stepped out of shops to offer quiet words of support. Some simply nodded, others whispered, "Welcome home," as they passed. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, casting a warm glow over the town that had finally opened its eyes to the truth. James and Emma walked together, their shadows stretching long behind them, while a gentle murmur of supportive voices followed them home like a blessing. The late summer breeze carried the rhythmic sound of hammering across the Walker farmland. James stood on a ladder, replacing worn shingles on the barn roof, while below him, a small crowd of neighbors worked together like a well-oiled machine. Mr. Peterson, the hardware store owner who had witnessed James's arrest months ago, carefully measured and cut fresh lumber. 2 doors down, Sarah Miller, the pastor's wife, directed a group of volunteers painting the barn's weathered walls a crisp, clean red. Emma darted between the workers, carrying water bottles on a tray. Her pigtails bounced with each step, and her face glowed with joy as she offered refreshments to everyone. "Thank you for helping us fix our barn," she said to each person, her smile infectious. James paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow as he watched his daughter. His heart swelled with pride at how she had grown through their trials, how her kindness had never wavered even in the darkest moments. "Hey, James!" called Mark Jensen from below. The young deputy who had helped clear his name now spent his off-duty hours helping with the restoration. "Got those support beams ready for the meeting room." James climbed down the ladder, his boots hitting the soft earth with a gentle thud. The interior of the barn had been transformed. Fresh pine boards lined the walls, and large windows had been installed to let in natural light. What was once a humble storage space was becoming something more, something meaningful. "Looking good," James said, clasping Mark's shoulder. "Dad would have loved seeing this place come alive again." More townspeople arrived throughout the morning, bringing food and supplies. Mrs. Thompson, who had once crossed the street to avoid James, now set up a folding table with homemade lemonade and sandwiches. Her grandson, Tommy, played catch with Emma in the yard, their laughter carrying across the property. Around noon, James called everyone together. The workers gathered in a circle, some sitting on hay bales, others leaning against fresh-painted walls. Emma settled beside her father, her small hand slipping into his. "I want to thank you all," James began, his voice steady and warm. "Not just for helping rebuild this barn, but for helping rebuild trust in our community." He looked around at the faces before him, faces that had once shown fear and suspicion, now filled with friendship and understanding. "My father believed in service, to his country and to his neighbors. That's why I've decided to turn this barn into a veterans community center." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. "A place where those who served can find support, where kids can learn about sacrifice and honor, and where our town can come together." Emma squeezed his hand and stood up straighter. "Can I tell them about the library corner, Daddy?" she asked excitedly. James nodded, and Emma turned to address the group. "We're going to have books about heroes," she announced proudly. "Real heroes, like my daddy and grandpa, and all the brave people who protect us." Several of the older veterans in the crowd dabbed at their eyes. Mr. Roberts, who had served with James's father, cleared his throat gruffly. "Your dad would be mighty proud, James, both of you." The afternoon stretched on as the work continued. The community center took shape hour by hour. James watched as Sheriff Dalton himself helped install a flagpole outside the barn. The same man who had once doubted him now worked alongside him, determined to right past wrongs. By evening, the barn was ready for its first informal gathering. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, and strings of warm lights twinkled overhead. The American flag hung proudly on one wall, beside a photo of James's father in his military uniform. People began filing in, filling the space with cheerful chatter. Veterans in their service caps sat in the front row, sharing stories with wide-eyed children. Young families settled in the back, bouncing babies on their knees. The divisions that had once torn the town apart seemed to melt away in the warmth of shared purpose. Emma stood at the door, greeting everyone like a proper hostess. "Welcome to Walker Veterans Community Center," she said again and again, beaming with pride. Each time she spoke the words, James felt his heart grow fuller. The gentle murmur of conversation filled the barn, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. Old stories were shared, new friendships were formed, and healing continued with each passing moment. James looked around at the transformed space, not just the physical changes but the transformation of hearts and minds. A young veteran who had recently returned from overseas approached James, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Sir," he said quietly, "I've been feeling lost since coming home. But this feels like somewhere I can belong." James remembered his own struggles, the weight of service, and the importance of community. "That's exactly what this place is for," he replied softly. "You're not alone anymore." The evening unfolded naturally, filled with shared stories and hopeful plans for the future. Children played in one corner where Emma had set up a reading nook, while adults gathered in small groups, discussing everything from upcoming events to personal challenges. As James watched his daughter lead a group of kids in a patriotic song they had learned in school, he felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The barn, once a symbol of their struggles, had become a beacon of hope, not just for him and Emma, but for the entire community. Golden sunlight draped across the old farmhouse porch like a warm blanket, casting long shadows through the white wooden railings. James Walker sat in his father's restored rocking chair, Emma curled contentedly in his lap. The gentle creaking of the chair mingled with children's laughter floating up from the yard, where Lily and several other kids played an enthusiastic game of tag among the tall grass. "Daddy, look!" Emma pointed as Lily dramatically fell into a patch of wildflowers, giggling. "She's pretending to be a fairy again." James smiled, his heart full as he watched the scene unfold. Just months ago, this yard had been empty and unwelcoming, marked by suspicion and fear. Now it bloomed with life and joy. The fresh white paint on the porch railings gleamed in the afternoon light, a weekend project that half the neighborhood had pitched in to help complete. Mrs. Henderson waved from where she sat in a lawn chair, keeping an eye on the children while working on her knitting. She'd brought over a basket of still warm muffins earlier, saying they were just because. But James knew it was her way of making amends for initially believing the rumors about him. "Tag, you're it!" Lily's voice rang out as she chased after Tommy Peterson, whose father was now one of James's closest friends in town. The sound of their footsteps thundered across the yard, stirring up butterflies from the flowering bushes Emma had planted along the walkway. A gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of late summer, and James felt Emma snuggle closer against his chest. Her small hand found his, their matching skin tones, a reminder of everything they'd faced together. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked softly, noticing her thoughtful expression. "I was just thinking," Emma said, watching her friends play. "Remember when those kids wouldn't talk to me at school? Now they come over almost every day." James squeezed her hand gently. "People can change when they open their hearts, Em. Sometimes they just need a chance to see the truth." From the barn came the sound of hammering volunteers working on converting part of the structure into the Veterans Community Center. The project had brought the town together in ways James never expected. Even Sheriff Dalton had shown up last weekend with his toolbox, working alongside Mark Jensen, who'd been promoted after helping expose Hensley's corruption. Emma twisted in James's lap to look up at him, her eyes serious.
"Are we safe now, Daddy?"
The question touched something deep in James's heart. He remembered all the nights he'd lain awake worrying, all the times he'd seen fear in her eyes when another police car drove past or when whispers followed them through town. But those days were behind them now. James pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "Yes, sweetheart, we're home for good." Emma's smile bloomed like sunshine breaking through clouds. She hugged him tight, then wiggled free as Lily called up from the yard. "Emma, come play with us." "Can I, Daddy?" "Go on." James chuckled, watching as she bounded down the porch steps to join her friends. The screen door creaked open behind him as Pastor Miller stepped out, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. He handed one to James before settling into the adjacent rocking chair. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" the pastor said, nodding toward the yard where the children played and the barn where community members worked together. James took a sip of the cool lemonade, savoring the tart sweetness. All around him, the farmhouse that had once felt like a symbol of isolation now radiated welcome. Flowers bloomed in window boxes Emma had painted herself. A fresh American flag, a gift from his veteran friends, waved proudly from the porch post. More neighbors were arriving now, carrying covered dishes for the evening's community potluck. The porch gradually filled with friendly faces and warm greetings. Mrs. Peterson set up a folding table for the food, while her husband joined the work crew at the barn. Someone started playing guitar, and the music drifted across the yard, mixing with conversation and laughter. The golden afternoon light bathed the farmhouse porch in a warm glow, as if nature itself was blessing this gathering. James watched Emma and Lily twirling in the yard, their shadows dancing long across the grass. His daughter's laughter rang clear and unafraid, the sound of perfect belonging. Around him, neighbors chatted and shared stories. The divisions of the past dissolved in the warmth of community. Even those who had once turned away now met his eyes with genuine smiles. The farmhouse had become exactly what he'd hoped, not just a home for him and Emma, but a place of healing for the entire town. James sat back in his rocking chair, feeling the solid wood beneath him, the same chair where his father had once sat, telling him stories of courage and perseverance. Now he and Emma were writing their own story here, one of redemption and hope, of faith rewarded and love triumphant. Emma and Lily raced back up to the porch, their cheeks flushed with exercise and joy. His daughter leaned against his chair, her face glowing with happiness as she looked out over their gathered neighbors, all the people who had become their extended family. She slipped her small hand into his, and together they smiled toward the golden horizon, toward all the bright tomorrows waiting ahead. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of James Walker, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.